So let's get right into it. Let's start with some kind of basic definitions. Let's operationally define our terms. What is personality? It's an organized combination of attributes, motives, values, and behaviors unique to each individual. We have three aspects of personality we're going to look at this slide. The first is dispositional traits, which are relatively enduring dimensions or qualities of personality along which people differ. For example, extroversion and aloofness. Characteristic adaptations, which are more situation-specific and changeable aspects of personality. Ways in which people adapt to their roles and environment includes things like motives, goals, and plans. Narrative identities, which are unique and integrative life stories that we construct about our pasts and futures to give ourselves an identity and our lives meaning. So kind of dispositional traits are typically what people think about when they talk about personality, at least in a Western context. And these are those things like extroversion, and you're thought to kind of be extroverted, for example, across all contexts. It's kind of enduring. You have it. It's a relatively stable trait that you have throughout your lifespan. Versus characteristic adaptation, the name kind of gives it away here, but you're adapting to your environment. Thus, it's more situation specific. And kind of as I stated already, ways in which people adapt to the roles and environment. So we have particular roles within our society. That role varies, not just among people, but within the same person. So you can be a parent one minute, you can be a student another minute, a teacher another minute, etc. And it's not just the roles, but also what you bring alongside. Kind of what you bring to the table of those roles and the environment. So things such as your goals, your motivation, what is your plan, why are you doing this thing, and how do you cope with particular struggles within this environment. So it's, again, kind of these things you're bringing to the table, but also within an environment where you're having to kind of adapt due to taking on specific roles and thus responsibilities within that role and, more globally, broad stated, just environments overall, kind of just that adaptive aspects of personality within different environments. And narrative identities, kind of the idea here is that we have things that happen to us in the past, things that are happening to us right now and in the future. And kind of the idea here is that, at least in a Western setting, you're trying to piece together all those different events and all those kind of different decisions that you made, and to kind of a coherent narrative that is thought to give your life meaning and kind of, at least in a Western setting, kind of tell a tale of development in a linear sense. Our next terms we're going to talk about are self-concept, self-esteem, and identity, and beginning with self-concept, which is defined as perceptions, positive and negatives of unique attributes and traits as a person, what I am. Self-esteem, which is evaluation of worth as a person based on all the positive and negative self-perceptions that make up self-concept. How good am I? Identity, overall sense of who they are, where they're heading, where they fit into society. So self-concept, so kind of just running through this, kind of the easy way to think about it is what I am. It's your perception of all your unique attributes and traits. While self-esteem is kind of like an evaluation, kind of a value assigned evaluation of all the positive and negative perceptions that you have, with the ultimate idea saying, how good am I? That could be on a particular task, in a particular role, or kind of just a more global, how good am I in general? And then identity is kind of like this really broad term, but it's this overall sense of who I am as a person. What am I doing with my life? Where do I fit in society? So kind of this maybe collection of all these terms together. So you have how good I am, and then what I am, and then kind of this global identity. Let's talk about specific theories of personality, beginning with Psychoanalytic. Freud believed personality formed during the first 5 years of life. He did not see psychosexual growth continuing during childhood. Anxieties, for example, arise from early experiences in the family, reveal themselves in adult personality traits. Neo-Freudians, such as Erikson, proposed that people undergo similar personality changes at similar ages, placed more emphasis on social influence such as peers, teachers, and culture, and saw the potential for personal growth and change throughout the lifespan. So these are consistent with previous Freud and Erikson theories. Freud kind of putting the most emphasis on these early childhood experiences, and those early childhood experiences kind of manifesting themselves in differing ways across the lifespan. And in the case of personality, anxieties about early life experiences with your family, for example, manifesting themselves in adult personality traits. Anthony Erikson, it's kind of the same thing as before. He is a stage theorist, which we've talked about before. So at each kind of stage of development, you're kind of unlocking new abilities. And those stages are thought to be kind of fairly consistent across cultures, and people reach those stages at similar ages. And unlike Freud, he puts more emphasis on the role of social influence, the impact of social influences on an individual, and in this case, personality. And he, like all his other kind of theories, is that believe that there's change throughout the lifespan, which is kind of reflected in each of his stages, kind of, again, unlocking these abilities and traits throughout the lifespan. Okay, jumping into trait theory. Trait models are interested primarily in describing and understanding the structure of personality. What makes up our personality, not what causes it. They're interested in individual differences versus commonalities among people. Personality is a set of dispositional trait dimensions along which people can differ. Assumes that personality traits are consistent across situation. They expect carryover in personality throughout the life, but do not believe it unfolds in a series of stages. So kind of the idea here is that this is kind of the traditional way that people think about personality in Western context. We kind of have these different traits, and these traits are stable, as I stated before, and and they are embedded within an individual. So you have these traits unique to you that's kind of relatively unaffected by the environment, and it's pretty stable across your lifespan. And they do not believe kind of in this idea of stages, but rather, as previously stated, that you have these dimensions of personality, which people differ on, that remain stable and kind of consistent over time. And how do trait theorists go about identifying the factors within personality? Well, they use factor analysis to reduce diversity of personality descriptors to underlying traits. Factor analysis analyzes correlations among response on personality inventories. It's based on a lexical approach, the assumption that the most crucial features of personality are embedded in our language. Factor analysis of trait terms in dictionaries and works of literature. This produced the Big Five, with the acronym kind of known as OCEAN, which is openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So kind of the idea here is, because for trait theorists, is that using a lexical approach, which again is kind of just the idea of just going to a dictionary or other famous works of literature and writing down, really typing out every single individual word. And then they perform this kind of the statistical analysis called factor analysis, which basically what it does is it looks at the thousands of words in the dictionary, in this case an English dictionary, and then kind of calculates how similar each of the words are to each other. So it kind of creates like these correlations of how closely words are together. Then what it does is kind of cluster. It's called clustering. They kind of cluster groups of correlations together, and then they label that cluster. So within openness to experience, I mean something like fearlessness, venturing, hesitancy, recklessness. So like, see how all those words are kind of like similar? Well, this is not exactly correct, but kind of the idea here is that those words will be highly correlated with each other, and there would be other words. Obviously, there are thousands of words, and those words, as open to experience words that are all clustered together, scientists, researchers will look at these sets of words, thousands of words that are really close together, and then they'll kind of look at how, using various statistical techniques, it doesn't matter. They basically just look at the groups of highly correlated words, and then what they do is they read all those words that are highly correlated, and then they label it. And what they label those words, hesitancy, fearlessness, etc., is openness to experience. So that's kind of the idea here. You go through dictionaries, works of arts, get a bunch of words, analyze their correlations, and then look at the words that make up these kind of large clusters of correlations, and then label them. And boom, there you go. You have your big five personality factors. So now I want to bring in information on cross-cultural variation of the big five, which are from kind of other studies and classes I've collected through the years, from other classes that I've taught, and just my own personal research. So in general, such investigations reveal that although the five-factor model does appear to be fairly cross-culturally robust, it is not an exhaustive list of personality traits in all cultures or how often the traits are used. Indigenous Chinese study found 4 of the same factors as the big five. Openness to experience, however, did not correlate with any of the Chinese factors. And a new factor, interpersonal relatedness, which was uncorrelated with any of the big five. A list of Filipino personality traits were developed, and it revealed 5 traits that were highly similar to the big five. But 2 additional factors, temperamentalness and negative valence, did not correlate strongly with any of the core 5. Study of Arabic speakers in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinian West Bank found evidence for the big five, plus honesty and unconventionality. The Tsimane, a foraging horticultural group in Bolivia, found very little evidence in support of the big five. Personality characteristics that were explained better by just 2 factors, neither of which approximated any of the big five. Other studies with non-industrialized populations have had comparable results. So kind of the idea here, what research supports, is that the big five are, some factors within the big five are kind of found across most cultures. However, when you look at different cultures, there are sometimes not all the 5 variables present within that culture. And not only that, but they also have their own unique personality factors within their culture that isn't found in the United States. So kind of going back to our examples here, an indigenous Chinese study found a new factor, interpersonal relatedness, which was not correlated with any of the big five. So remember how I was explaining factor analysis before, but now what they're doing is they're looking at that cluster of words, that personality trait within the indigenous Chinese language, and then compare and seeing how correlated that factor is with the big five personality factors in the United States. And what these researchers found that it was not correlated, which means that there is a personality trait within this indigenous Chinese group that is not found in the United States. And a similar thing was found in a study in the Philippines, which found that they found this time all 5 personality traits that exist in the United States, but this time they found 2 additional factors. So in the Chinese study, you can see that there was only 4 of the 5, and they found out 1 additional factor. Now we have all 5, and it's 2 additional factors. And then various studies in Arabic-speaking countries have found additional factors. And interestingly, when you look at these kind of subsistence farming groups that still exist in the world, when you look at those groups and compare them to the United States Big Five, that's when you start seeing radically different results. And so, for example, this indigenous Bolivian tribe found only 2 personality factors, neither of which were correlated with the Big Five factors found in the United States. Now let's talk about cross-cultural findings in the United States, because the United States is quite large. Researchers looked at this, and they found that north central Great Plains, especially around Minnesota, Wisconsin, is a friendly and conventional region where residents are the highest in the country for the traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. The western states, from Oregon to Arizona, are a relaxed and creative region where there is the lowest neuroticism and the highest openness to experience. The northeastern states, especially New York and Massachusetts, are a temperamental and uninhibited region, where people score the highest on eroticism and the lowest on conscientiousness. Extroverted people are more likely to appreciate wide open vistas such as oceans, whereas introverts prefer more close-in mountainous regions. So kind of the idea here, which we all understand, is that throughout the United States there are kind of pockets of personality traits that are more commonly found or less commonly found. And what the researchers did was kind of look at this, and they found indeed pockets of clusters of personality traits found in the United States, and then labeled them accordingly, which you can see the figure on the right if you look at the PowerPoint slides. Okay, let's talk about another theory in personality, which is social learning. It rejects the notion of universal stages of personality development, questions existence of enduring personality traits across the lifespan, and emphasizes that people's behavior is influenced by interactions in certain situations and environments. So kind of the idea here, comparing it to the dispositional idea of personality, is that there are not universal stages of personality development, and they argue that personality traits are not these enduring traits that exist across all circumstances for across time, but rather personality is influenced by interactions with particular individuals in particular environments and in particular circumstances. All right, let's talk about infants' emerging self. Infants may be born without a sense of self. Researchers argue that it develops based on their perceptions of their bodies and actions and grows out of their interactions with caregivers. Theorized capacity to differentiate self from the world at 2 to 3 months of age as they display a sense of agency, sense that they can cause things to happen in the world. At 18 months, infants recognize themselves visually as distinct individuals, and babies also form categorical selves by 18 to 24 months. They classify themselves into social categories based on age, sex, and other visible characteristics. So kind of the idea here is that researchers are arguing that the baby, a newborn infant, does not understand, the self. But through kind of movements, interacting with the world, which is kind of related to motor movements and social development, or social development and motor development, I should say, kind of creates this idea that you can act on the world, you have a sense of agency, which kind of contributes to the development of the self. And through time, infants are able to recognize themselves as distinct kind of entities, and through more time, through more development, are able to categorize themselves based on visual and kind of social traits such as age, sex, and other visible characteristics. Now let's talk about self-awareness in infancy. Self-recognition depends on cognitive development, which requires development of certain brain areas. Developmentally delayed children recognize themselves in the mirror when they reach a mental age of 18 months. Social interaction. Throughout the life, we create our self-concepts from information and feedback we receive from interacting with other people. Cultural context, individualistic cultures, which emphasize autonomy, encourage children to pursue their own goals as individuals, and collectivist cultures, which emphasize relatedness to others. Individuals place relatively more emphasis on collective goals than individual ones. It's kind of this idea of developing self-awareness, and there are kind of these global theories of when infants are able to recognize themselves in the mirror, and researchers kind of previously thought through much of psychology's history that this is kind of global phenomenon. But what further research has found across culture is that this is not the case. In cultural contexts, such as a degree of individuality and collectivism within a culture impacts the time of which that a infant develops an understanding that they are looking at themselves in a mirror, basically. It's kind of this idea that I am self, that very me-focused understanding of yourself as its own entity, free of other entities interacting with you. The idea being that you exist regardless of like who's around you and whatever particular items are around you in your environment. And you can see how that would have different cultural effects depending on the degree of collectivism within a particular culture. One study I wanted to bring into this class, and kind of one concept, is this idea versus objective self-awareness versus subjective self-awareness. Objective self-awareness is a state of mind in which a person considers the self from the outside in. Perspective of the subject, the I, that observes and interacts with the world. Subjective self-awareness is a state of mind in which a person considers the self from the inside out. Self can be experienced as the me that is observed and interacted with by other. So I'm going to stop here for a second just to kind of expand on this so we understand our terms before we get to the study. The idea here is that for objective self-awareness, that you're an object that that exists among other objects. You are taking the perspective of how others look at you. So you have an outside-in perspective. So outsiders looking at you. It's outside-in. And you're an object. That's the idea here behind objective self-awareness. Versus subjective self-awareness, wherein it's the opposite pattern, where you consider yourself from the inside out. So your self-awareness revolves around kind of your own subjective understanding of yourself, which you are then kind of like projecting outward. Okay, versus the other way, where you're kind of taking the perspective of these other people are evaluating me, and just overall the state of mind where you're focusing on the self from the outside in. Okay, so outside in versus inside out, creating differences in self-awareness. So a group of researchers asked and placed Japanese American students in front of a mirror, or just in front of nothing, like whatever. They're looking at a wall or they're reading a book or whatever, and were then asked to evaluate themselves. Americans became significantly more self-critical in front of a mirror than they were when no mirror was present. The Japanese were unaffected by the mirror. Regardless of whether they were viewing their mirror image and seeing how they appear to the world, or just thinking about themselves the way they typically do, they self-evaluated the same way. When Americans are considering themselves as an object, like a mirror image, they appear to be having ideas about the self that are similar to those of the Japanese, with or without the mirror. So kind of the idea here is we're getting at an empirical measurement of differences in self-awareness, that is objective and subjective. If you put, and in this case, if you take two groups of individuals, really four groups, but two ethnic groups, Japanese and American students, and then place them in front of two different conditions. One of the conditions are you place Japanese and American students in front of a mirror, and then asked to evaluate themselves. Versus putting Japanese and American students in front of something else, a non-mirror, and just ask, hey, evaluate yourself. Well, for Japanese people, they are unaffected by the presence of the mirror. Regardless of the mirrors there or not, in other words, they will evaluate themselves in similar ways. However, if you put American college students in front of a mirror, they'll be much more self-critical of themselves in their self-evaluations. So kind of the idea here is that when a mirror is presented to a more individualistic culture, a culture that relies more on a subjective self-awareness, the presence of a mirror forces an individual to view themselves as an object, wherein there are changes to the self-evaluation patterns of those individuals who are viewing themselves in a mirror grew up in a subjective self-awareness context, in a individualistic cultural context. So what's happening is their patterns of self-evaluation begin to reflect Japanese patterns of self-evaluation, because now they can actually physically see themselves as an object, and they're able to the patterns of self-evaluations become more similar across those cultures. So kind of the idea here is that we have, if you ask Americans and Japanese college students who are not sitting in front of the mirror to self-evaluate themselves, there'll be large differences, which you can see on the graph. But again, if you put them in front of the mirror, those differences decrease. So kind of the idea here is that when you force an individual to think or look at themselves in a certain way, in this case from the outside in, from an objective self-awareness, even individuals within who grew up in an individualistic culture or in a culture that stresses subjective self-awarenesses can access those other ways of thinking and show decreases in the discrepancy between certain patterns of self-evaluations across cultures. So just kind of a cool way that you can see differences in self-awareness and in ways that researchers can at least temporarily manipulate those patterns of self-awareness and self-evaluations. Next, temperament categories, which are defined as early genetically based but environmentally influenced tendencies to respond in predictable ways to events that serve as the building blocks of later personality. We have easy temperament, which represent about 40% of children, which are content or happy, open and adaptable to new experiences, and tolerate frustrations. Difficult temperament, which represent about 10% of students, which are active, irritable, and irregular in their habits. They react negatively to changes in routine and are slow to adapt. Slow to warm up temperament, which is about 15% of children. They're characterized as being relatively inactive, somewhat moody, moderately regular in daily schedules, slow to adapt but respond mildly, look away from cuddler rather than kicking, eventually adapt, show a quiet interest in new things. And these numbers are typically seen in Western context, but this is kind of how it's thought globally. And they're kind of straightforward here, so easy, easy are going to be easier, they're more adaptive. Difficult, more irritable and kind of slow to adapt. And slow to warm up is they are they're less kind of reactive, and they do kind of demonstrate kind of this moodiness and kind of slower process of adaptation, but kind of with time they demonstrate an interest in new things. So it's kind of all these the characteristics of all these temperament categories are kind of like embedded within the labels: easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. Moving on to dimensions of temperament, Rothbart and colleagues identified 3 dimensions of temperament. Types versus dimensions emphasize self-regulation, how easily infants become emotionally aroused, and how able they are to control or regulate their arousal. We have surgency/extroversion, which is a tendency to actively, confidently, and energetically approach new experiences in emotionally positive ways. Negative affectivity, tendency to be sad, easily frustrated and irritable. Effortful control, which is ability to focus and shift attention when desired, inhibit responses. So kind of the idea here is that there are these dimensions of temperament that really do kind of deal with the ability to self-regulate and the degree to which infants become emotionally aroused and kind of the ability to control that arousal. And why it's dimensions is because it's really kind of more of a continuum. So you're on these scales of negative affectivity, for example, and I'll just make up the scale, 0 to 100, with 100 being an extreme tendency to be sad and easily frustrated, and 0 never being sad and never being frustrated. Goodness of fit, the extent to which the child's temperament is compatible with the demands and expectations of the social world to which they must adapt. Prenatal stress, substance abuse, and genetics interact to shape temperaments. Postnatal environments help determine how adapted particular temperamental qualities are and whether they persist or change. Shy, inhibited children are likely to remain inhibited if their parents are either overprotective or angry and impatient, but can overcome inhibition if their parents create a, quote, good fit by preparing them for potentially upsetting experiences and making firm but reasonable demands. So kind of the idea here is that we have these temperaments, right? What this is getting at is postnatally, how well does a child's temperament fit within a given environment's demands and expectations? And that degree of fit determines how adaptive those personality traits, or I should say, those temperamental qualities are, and whether they persist or change. So it's kind of so you have like these temperamental qualities that a child is bringing to the table, and then you have the environment. And the idea is how well do those things mesh? How well do those things fit together? And it's called the goodness of fit. An example is, and kind of a typical example is parent-child interactions, wherein a shy child may remain an inhibited child, and you can imagine scenarios where a child is too shy, too inhibited, which could be not particularly adaptive to a given environment. And a parent can choose to parent overprotectively or angrily at a child, which could contribute to that particular temperamental quality, shyness, persisting over time. Versus a parent choosing to help a child overcome inhibition by maybe placing them in circumstances wherein they can successfully overcome their shyness. So kind of like this scaffolding idea. You put them in a circumstance where that's a little bit challenging, but one that they can, rise to the occasion and meet. And over time, by placing them in those circumstances, giving firm but kind of fair demands, / opportunities to grow, that child's shyness can be managed to an extent to such an extent that it allows for adaptation. That allows for, I should say, one adaptation of that temperamental quality, shyness, and that adaptation deals with specifically the ability to literally just interact within your social world. So it's the degree to which an environment shapes a child's temperamental qualities, which then in return shapes the degree to which a child can successfully navigate within the demands and the expectations of their social world. But you can also imagine a scenario where more of these macro features, particular economic systems, welfare systems, political systems, that emphasize particular personality traits or temperamental qualities, creating easier adaptations, higher levels of goodness of fits. So again, the classic example is parent-child, but this also can exist at these more macro, political, economic, structural levels. Elaborating on sense of self in childhood, by age 2, toddlers are using personal pronouns. A preschool child's emerging self-concept is concrete and physical. By age 8, self-conceptions emphasize psychological and social qualities. They use personality trait terms to describe themselves, such as funny and smart, and they define themselves as part of a social group. I'm a second grader, for example. They're more capable of social comparison, using information about how they compare with others to characterize and evaluate themselves. I can hit a baseball versus I'm the best baseball player in my class. So kind of the big picture here is that over time, children start to characterize themselves and shape their self-concepts around psychological and social qualities. They use personality trait terms such as funny and smart. They define themselves as part of a social group, and they're able to more accurately compare themselves socially. So there's a difference between I can hit a baseball versus I'm the best baseball player of all time. And through time, with development, children become better at that ability to socially compare themselves to other people's abilities within their groups and kind of larger society as they age. Self-esteem in childhood. Harder found that self-esteem becomes more differentiated and multidimensional with age. By mid-elementary school, children differentiate among scholastic competence, social acceptance, behavioral conduct, athletic competence, and physical appearance. So just kind of more different aspects of self-esteem emerge with age, and children can have low self-esteem, for example, and athletic confidence, but have high self-esteem and social acceptance. So what are some influences on the development of self-esteem? Twin study researchers argue that self-esteem is heritable. Some children display more competence than others, experience more success, and come out better in social comparisons as a result. Warm, democratic parents give a sense that their opinion matter. Giving children an inflated and unrealistic sense of their worth is likely to do more harm than good. Providing children who are low in self-esteem with exaggerated praise can cause children to shy away from challenges, possibly because they believe that it will be judged by impossibly high standards. So kind of the idea here, big takeaways here, is that some influences of self-esteem can be the levels of competence. So if a child comes out of the gate and are just like an expert baseball player or an expert mathematical whiz, whatever that means in kindergarten edition, I guess, then they'll experience more success, and they will come out better in social comparisons as a result. So kind of the idea here is that you're better at something, you are experiencing success, and therefore you're going to have higher levels of self-esteem, or let self-esteem affect you more, or just kind of, like I stated before, just have a higher level of self-esteem because you're so good at it already. So you have demonstrated ability of being good at it versus someone who's bad at sports, when they're 5 years old, that competence level contributing to the levels of self-esteem within that dimension of self-esteem. Particular parenting practices, for example, some researchers argue, so democratic parents, the idea that parents give their child a sense that their parent matters, which means that they're going to evaluate themselves as being worthy of giving their opinion, which increases self-esteem. Researchers do make the point that giving a child too much self-esteem and overinflated, unrealistic sense of worth, it kind of has a negative effects. It can cause a child to receive excessive amounts of praise, but a child can interpret that as kind of like these expectations. So telling a child, "Oh, you're the greatest baseball player of all time," and then a child's kind of like is somewhat aware that they're not the greatest baseball player, not even the best baseball player in their class, and then they'll recognize those standards as impossible, that they would be outside their zone of proximal development, for example, kind of a little throwback to Vygotsky. And thus kind of shy away from those challenges because they're literally just impossible to meet. Other influences of self-esteem that I wanted to bring into this class, and that is differences between North Americans and East Asians. So there are striking cultural differences between white North Americans and East Asians. 93% of European Canadians report high self-esteem levels versus 55% of Japanese individuals, one study found. One answer is that children learn from their parents. So kind of the question being, how do these differences emerge? And from interacting with their parents in instructions and also from their parents' teaching. Okay. So for example, Americans and Taiwanese parents have divergent views on the importance of self-esteem. American mothers consider self-esteem central to child rearing and feel that it should be cultivated. However, Taiwanese parents feel that high self-esteem may be detrimental to the child. As a result, American parents tend to recall more stories about their children's past successes, whereas Taiwanese parents are more likely to recall stories about their children's past failures. At a societal level, American schools are more likely than East Asian schools to emphasize the development of students' self-esteem. So kind of the idea here is that through time, particular cultural practices, which exist on a parent-child level, but also these kind of macro cultural values and these macroeconomic practices and political practices that influence or trickle down to a classroom setting, and particular parenting practices. In the case that we just covered, American and Taiwanese literally just having different views on the value of self-esteem, with Americans considering self-esteem much more important. So kind of this idea that's kind of, again, you have high, where Americans have these high evaluations of worth. This is the question, how good am I? Well, the answer to that is I'm really damn good. And you can imagine that this kind of being a more valued viewpoint in an individualistic culture versus kind of a collectivist culture, which we've already talked about, kind of that emphasis on these group dynamics, and placing more emphasis on collective goals versus individual ones found in individualist cultures. You can see why high self-esteem kind of wouldn't fit as well, or at least degree of high self-esteem would not fit as well in those within those cultures. And these are just examples in what types of stories American parents and Taiwanese parents recall about their children, and just the school system in general, with American schools emphasizing development of student self-esteem, while East Asian schools being less likely to emphasize this development of self-esteem. And again, this is kind of related to many factors, but it's this association is typically found in this distinction is found in individualistic versus collectivist cultures, wherein collectivist cultures having lower levels of self-esteem and placing less emphasis on it overall. Which kind of gets to the point that the idea of self-esteem is not a globally kind of universal human agreed upon quality, or the worth of self-esteem is not valued the same across cultures, and it argues kind of against this idea of universal across cultures stage-like development of self-esteem, or at least dampers that idea. It brings the idea that there is a cultural variance in this, and kind of very extreme cultural variance when comparing East Asian countries versus North American countries. So as personality develops, inhibited, easier said, very easy for me to say, over-controlled 3-year-olds tend to become teenagers who are cautious and unassertive. Well-adjusted 3-year-olds tend to end up as well-adjusted adults. And dimensions of early temperament are related to big 5 personality traits later in life. Self-control in children is correlated with high school performance. So kind of the idea here, especially for this trait theory, is that individuals kind of maintain stability in their traits, and there are certain correlations of temperament to the formation of big 5 personality traits later in life, and some aspects of childhood self-control, for example, being correlated with high school performance. And just some global takeaways from developing personality. Freud's view that personality is formed by age 5 is not supported. Personalities change in response to environmental influences. Some aspects of personality do not seem to stabilize until adolescence. Correlations between early childhood traits and adult traits are quite small. A goodness of fit concept can help explain continuity and change in children's personalities. So again, kind of the idea that the degree to which a person fits within their environment, and that degree of fit, I should say, influences the persistence and change within particular temperamental qualities, or just personality more generally. Now let's talk about personality in adolescence, and again bringing additional material into the course. This test called the Who I Am test / the 20 statements test. So kind of the idea here is that a individual is presented with a piece of paper that just says the words I am 20 times, and then there's a line, and then you write I, and so I am is written, and you just write what are you over and over again 20 times. Well, there was a study of Kenyans and American undergraduate students. They were administered the Who I Am test. Kenyan participants were divided into groups that should theoretically vary in terms of how much they were exposed to Western cultural ways. Kenyan university students in Nairobi should be the most Westernized group in their sample. This is thought to be because the educational system was shaped by their British colonial past. Employed adults in Nairobi should be slightly less Westernized, and for just a pause, Nairobi is the capital of Kenya. In traditional indigenous Kenyan groups, Samburu and the Maasai would be the least Westernized. So kind of the idea here is that we have three sets of Kenyan groups, with students in a university setting being the most Westernized, partly due to the kind of the structure of it originally taking place within a Western colonial political environment. Individuals employed in Nairobi, where, it's kind of like a big city, but still, so kind of the idea is they're exposed to some Western values, but still within a Kenyan cultural context. And then traditional indigenous groups, which are at least Westernized because they're not in university setting, they're not really interacting in a big city, but rather in kind of these rural subsistence communities. Granted, some individuals do go in the city, but kind of on average is what I'm saying. And what did the research find? That they found that the most frequent self-descriptions for the Americans were personal characteristics, such as their traits, attitudes, and abilities. 48% of their statements were such statements. Similar statements made up less than 2% of the Maasai and Samburu self-descriptions. Their responses generally reflected their social identity. Their roles and membership accounted for more than 60% of their statements. And in contrast, those types of statements, those social identity statements, only made up 7% of American self-descriptions. So kind of the idea here is that, again, we're kind of asked, who are you? You're going to define yourself. And what this researchers found is that for American undergraduate students, they're going to say, I'm great, I read well, I'm funny, I'm adventurous, those kind of things, those traits, those attitudes, those abilities. But for groups of Kenyans who are exposed to the least amount of Western influence, they show way less of those types of responses. And in general, the majority of the responses deal with their social identity, so their roles in their membership. So you can say, I'm a member of X tribe, I'm a parent, I'm a teacher, I'm a fireman, whatever. So social roles, much more emphasized in non-Western settings versus in Western settings, in this case, American undergraduate students, much more focus on traits, attitudes, and abilities, which again kind of reflects that notion, that dispositional notion of personality, that personality is derived from within. It's stable regardless of your role, and it's kind of unaffected by these social relationships, or I should say at least less affected by social relationships. While Kenyans, in this case Samburu and Maasai's, ethnic groups, kind of not viewing personality that way and not describing themselves that way as well. And yes, this is a photo from me with actually the Maasai tribe in Kenya when I was 19 years old. And it's alas, every time I look at this photo, it gets further and further in the past. And continuing on in this study, Americans do sometimes think of themselves in terms of social identity, and Maasai and Samburu sometimes consider their own personality traits. The degree to which people from these cultures consider these different aspects of themselves varies considerably. The other two Kenyan groups fall in between, with the university students being closer to the American pattern and the workers more closely resembling the Maasai and Samburu patterns. So kind of the idea here is that it's not an all or nothing. Individualism and collectivism and different forms of self-descriptors fall on a continuum, but obviously different cultures value different views of the self, and thus describe themselves in different ways. And individuals, kind of as I stated, that the more you interact with Western cultures, in this case university students in Kenya, having the most similar responses to their American undergraduate colleagues compared to workers in Nairobi, kind of being in between, kind of like how we hypothesized, and then the Maasai and Samburu having the largest differences between their self-descriptors and American undergraduate descriptors. And on the right, you can kind of see what the test looks like in some of the graphs from the study. Continuing on with the development of self-concept in adolescence, self-concepts become less physical and more psychological. I have brown eyes versus I'm sad. Less concrete and more abstract. I love sports versus I am a truthful person. More differentiated, accepted by large peer group, close friends, and romantic partner, different selves in different social contexts. More integrated and coherent, explain they are happy in some situations and grumpy in others, and are more reflective upon, become more self-aware, think about the self, sometimes painfully self-conscious. So kind of the idea is we're moving on from what children are already doing, but we're continuing on this moving on process from physical traits or physical descriptions, as I say, to more psychological descriptions. Moving on from more concrete descriptors such as I love sports, I love math, whatever, to more abstract. So these notions of truthfulness, I participate in justice, those kind of more abstract terms. Adolescents start to describe themselves and understand that they are happy sometimes, grumpy in others, and have different kind of selves in different social contexts. And also, and this could be, these development can be, the increased reflection upon themselves can contribute to this development. But if you kind of overthink it, which we talked about throughout this course, this can kind of get you stuck in a mind palace and then become overly self-conscious, and it can lead to and contribute to, I should say, negative developmental outcomes. Self-esteem development in adolescence. Self-esteem tends to decrease from childhood to early adolescence. They become more realistic about strengths and weaknesses. They are temporarily unsure of themselves when transitioning to middle school, unhappy with body changes, and they're most common among white females. Most adolescents maintain moderate or high levels of self-esteem over the adolescent years or emerge from this developmental period with higher self-esteem. So we kind of see a slight dip and then either kind of return to their previous high levels of self-esteem or even an increase of self-esteem. But there are gender differences. Most common among white females is kind of unhappy with these changes associated with puberty. Forging an identity, Erikson. I had to throw in an Erikson slide. So in adolescence, Erikson argues, is a critical period in the lifelong process of forming an identity as a person. Identity versus role confusion. Adolescents ask who they are and must establish social and vocational identities. Otherwise, they will remain confused about the roles they should play as adults. Adolescents must integrate varied perceptions of the self-concept into a coherent sense of self. What kind of career do I want? Where do I fit in? So kind of the idea here is that we have to, or adolescents kind of in general, have to identify who they are as a person, which involves establishing their social and vocational identities. And if they are unable to do this, kind of this is the Erikson theory more globally, if they're unable to resolve this conflict, this forging of identity conflict, then this confusion about what roles they should play as adults and kind of more broadly in society continues on throughout development until some change happens in a later stage. So what are some of those obstacles that may contribute to poor developmental outcomes within this stage, as Erikson argues? The idea of an identity crisis, a revision of body image, adjust to being sexual beings, cognitive growth allows thinking about possible future selves, social demands require them to grow up, society supports use by allowing them a moratorium period. All right, so kind of the idea here is that adolescents are experiencing an identity crisis, which we've already talked about, which requires a bunch of adjustments and new demands by society. All of a sudden, you're out of school, you have all these new demands, these bills, these responsibilities, etc. And kind of the idea here is that society can contribute and support and buffer these stressors by allowing them a moratorium period. So this is, again, kind of an idea that these macro structures can contribute to development. In this case, a moratorium period, and that could be various societal expectations, so allowing children or adolescents, emerging adults, to give them some slack. The idea is like they're working through it. Don't give them all the responsibilities at once, but also maybe give them an opportunity for, in particular, like poor or adolescents and emerging adults who grew up in poor households, for example, giving them an opportunity to go to college through Pell Grants, for example, something along those lines. So kind of the societal supports contributing to the likelihood of experiencing or resolving, I should say, this identity crisis that Erikson hypothesized exists during adolescence. So just another example of these larger macro features of society contributing to developmental outcomes. And again, it's kind of hopefully you've noticed kind of a theme in this course, kind of trying to move away from the idea that only these individual interactions, especially in a household, affects development, but rather these larger systems contributing to and arguably shaping those social relationships in the household. Continuing on with another theorist of forging identity, Marcia, he classified adolescence into one of 4 identity statuses based on the progress toward an identity in each of the several domains: occupational, religious, political, etc. The key question are whether an individual has experienced a crisis, which means they seriously grappled with identity issues and explored alternatives, and achieved a commitment, resolved the questions raised and settled on an identity. Only 5% of adolescents were in the same identity status in 4 areas. So basically we have 4 identity statuses, and we forge the identity within these 4 identity statuses. And in order to do so, we have to first experience the crisis, so kind of grapple with your identity issue, and then you can resolve the questions that are raised within that crisis. So in order to grow and to create an identity, you have to kind of confront and deal with your identity issues and explore alternatives, Marcia argues. And there are kind of like 4 statuses that we're going to go over. That is 4 identity statuses. In the diffusion status, which is thought to occur between 12 to 15 years old, there's no crisis and no commitment. Haven't yet thought about who they are. The foreclosure status, which is accepting identities suggested to them by their parents or other people, and a commitment without a crisis. Moratorium status, 18 years old, experiencing crisis and actively exploring identity. Religious, drugs, majors, posting. Identity achievement involves not only raising questions, but answering them. 20% of 18-year-olds and 40% of college students, and approximately 50% of 24-year-olds. So kind of the idea here is that it's kind of stage-like, but really it's less concrete. With each age, you have different identity statuses that represent the extent to which you have experienced a crisis and the extent to which you've achieved a commitment in a particular identity. So in diffusion statuses, you have no crisis and you have no commitment. You haven't really thought about this at all. Versus foreclosure, you have maybe slightly thought about it, but really you've just been given an identity and then you accept it. So you have a commitment to an identity, but you really never ever grappled with it or explored alternatives. So you have a commitment without a crisis. Then you have moratorium status, which you're experiencing a crisis, but you haven't resolved it yet. You're exploring, you're questioning your religious beliefs, you're doing drugs, you're switching majors, you're posting on Twitter, and you're just kind of working through things. And then finally, identity achievement. So you've raised questions, but you've also kind of answered questions as well. And you can see the varying, that with age, the percentage of individuals achieving their identity achievement increases, but still only at 50% at 24 years of age. And a specific key identity that is forged is ethnic identity. And it's an important aspect of identity development, which is the sense of personal identification with an ethnic group and its values and cultural traditions. It begins in infancy, and adolescence proceeds through the same identity statuses as they do in forming other identities, and positive ethnic identity serves as a buffer against social and ethnic discrimination. So kind of the idea here is that you're within a particular ethnic group, within a particular country, and working your way through that identity formation and achieving identity within an ethnic group buffers, again, kind of this idea that it dampens the negative effects of stressors within their environment, and that could be, racial and ethnic discrimination, or also just other broad stressors found within an environment. So this ethnic identity could helping buffer, limit the long-term developmental negative effects of racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination more broadly. Moving on to vocational identity and choice. Individuals search for an optimal fit between one's personality and an occupation. Person-environment fit is kind of like goodness of fit. Investigative enjoys learning, solving, social, interacting with others, realistic, artistic, conventional, and enterprising. So kind of the idea is that we have these categories that that you can think of as a continuum, and you have different fits within those particular categories. So you can look at social, interacting with and helping other people. So if you're high in that, maybe your best vocational fit would be a teacher, for example. And it's similar to goodness of fit, but because it's a person environmental fit, I should say. So kind of the idea that your personality matching and kind of fitting with the particular aspects of your personality, if you're a dispositional trait kind of theorist, certain levels of extroversion, for example, being a good match for an occupation. So that may be, some kind of person that talks a lot versus a profession where that attracts more introverted people. So it's kind of this optimal fit between your personality and your occupation, contributing to this person environmental fit, which contributes to the development of your vocational identity. Barriers to vocational choice. Adolescents begin to take into account the realities of the job market and the physical and economic or educational requirements. Poor children face limited opportunities and barriers to occupations which match their personality. They may aim high at first, but as they become more aware of constraints on their in their environment, they lower their aspirations and aim toward jobs they think they can get rather than jobs which interest them. Women often have to choose careers they think will make it easier for them to combine work and family. How might this play out in low-income countries? So kind of the idea here is we've talked about this idea where you have certain abilities and you're looking for the perfect person-environment fit based on your abilities and the abilities that are stressed within that job. But, we live in the real world here, and adolescents begin to recognize that, and they look at their environment. They look at the job market. So did you graduate, for example, during a pandemic? Did you graduate during the Great Depression, the Great Recession, etc.? And also kind of the educational requirements that are needed at a job. So did you didn't have the opportunity maybe to go to a 4-year college, you instead went to trade school or went to a 2-year college, or you didn't go at all, which will both impact your prospects of finding having a great person environment fit with that is between your abilities and the requirements of a job. Poor children in particular face limited opportunities and barriers to occupation would match their personality. So imagine living in a poor neighborhood, there'll probably be less industries. Well, there are less industries, I should say. And kind of not only that, but just less opportunities to travel to cities, towns, contexts where there are more employment opportunities. And that could be because you don't have a car, or you have a shitty car, or you have to rely on public transportation. Also gas prices, etc. There's not a strong public transportation infrastructure in the United States compared to other European and East Asian countries. Thus, individuals will recognize these limitations. They recognize that, I don't have money to go to the next town, drive an hour to a better job market. I am graduating in a pandemic. I don't have a master's degree or something along those lines, or I have a lot of or I did get a degree and I have a ton of student debt that I have to get rid of immediately. Can contribute to an individual kind of moving on from this perfect or optimal person environment fit and just getting a job that will pay the bills. This is also a factor with women in the workforce. More so in the past, as now there are more 2-person households working for a whole lot of reasons. One big reason being that income stagnation rates, for decades, and cost of living going up, which thus requiring more people to work to kind of just maintain a standard of living. But kind of just historically, in traditional gender roles, wherein women historically have stood home to raise children, while men working in jobs. And you can imagine that this is playing out even more harshly in low-income countries, where there are even less opportunities for optimal person job fits, less ability to publicly access those more limited opportunities, and there may be various additional barriers such as violence or even less public transportation infrastructure. So kind of again, not only just individuals not being able to properly achieve their vocational identity, but rather these macro structures graduating into a depression epidemic, living in a low-income country, and particular public policies such as public transportation contributing to an individual's opportunity to achieve higher levels of optimal person environmental fits within a job. Self-esteem rises gradually through the adult years until the mid-60s and then drops in late old age. Sense of clarity about who they are rises through middle age and declines in old age, and gender differences in self-esteem disappear with age. So basically, as individuals get older in a Western context, these differences in self-esteem declines. It's kind of a big takeaway point here. How can older adults maintain positive self-images? Reducing the gap between the ideal and real self. The gap is small during childhood, widens during adolescence, and then closes again. Changing one's goals and standards of self-evaluations. Walking a mile with a physical disability may be a larger achievement than running a mile at 10 years old. Making social comparisons to older people, comparing the people in other cohorts with similar physical and cognitive conditions, and avoiding negative stereotyping, not internalize ageism. So kind of the idea is how that you properly, or more appropriately, I guess I should say, evaluate yourself compared to other people within your cohort and with similar physical and or cognitive disabilities, which will allow you to not make unrealistic comparisons and have a kind of a better self-image of yourself. And also not internalizing stereotype threats, which we've kind of discussed throughout this class, the idea that with old age, you automatically are going to experience particular declines, when research, or more recent research, has found that that is not universally true. And finally, our last cultural differences that I want to discuss is differences of the self, and particularly the difference between the independent view of self and the interdependent view of self. The self derives its identity from inner attributes in the independent view of self. It assumes to reflect a person's inner essence. Unique, arise from the individual and not from interaction with others. Interdependent view of self is views self as defined by social relationships and roles. Behavior depends on the perceptions of others' thoughts, feelings, and actions. Organize their own psychological experiences in response to what others are apparently thinking and doing. Participants in a larger social unit. So I find it sometimes easier to just look at this visual illustration here. And you can see on the left-hand side an independent view of self. And just look at the differences here. You see that there's that solid line around that individual, which kind of reflects that the self, and really personality kind of in general, is derived from these inner attributes that are, kind of related to this inner essence, these stable traits that rise from the individual and are not affected by interaction with other people. So you can see that really, that again, that kind of speaks to that stable line. And although you have individuals kind of within your in-group kind of brushing up against you, and to some extent does affect you, but that the self largely and personality traits largely are viewed as something that's unchangeable, stable, and arising from within. First is the interdependent view of self. Now look at the line around the individual here. It's a dotted line, which reflects the fact that these social groups, these roles that you take, in your behavior are dependent on other people's thoughts, their feelings, and your kind of just your place within kind of larger society, your larger social unit. So therefore, these traits in your personality are not these traits that are stable and emerging only from yourself, but rather are defined by your social relationships in your roles. And people with this view of self take into account other people's perceptions in their social roles when defining themselves. And this goes back to the Kenya study that we talked about before. They would be expected to have more of an interdependent view of self, wherein, and I should say specifically a Kenyan study, the Maasai individuals from the indigenous troop in Kenya with little Western influence, and thus kind of little independent view of self-influence, describing themselves, those Maasai people describing themselves through social roles within their community. And one other point I want to make here is that look at the difference between the in-group line for the independent and interdependent view of self. In the interdependent view of self, that in-group line is a solid line, versus in the independent group of self, it's a dotted line. So that represents that although social roles play a much larger role within a individual, among individuals, I should say, with interdependent views of self, it's really the in-group individuals who are having the most disproportionate influence on an individual's view of self. That's because you have to kind of think this through, right? So if social relationships are so important, define so much of who you are, how you view yourself, you really value those social relationships. So you have to kind of protect who you let in your in-group. So it's very difficult to get in the in-group, and it's difficult to get out, because those social relationships, that in-group dynamics are so influential on an individual. Versus an independent view of self, you can see again kind of this in-group line, it's this dotted line, because people with this view of self, that independent view of self, view their personality, themselves, as this solid line, this enclosed inner essence. It really doesn't matter as much if you're interacting with someone in your in-group or out-group. It doesn't affect your view of self, because your view of self is derived from yourself, your inner essence, your own being, your subjective self-awareness. So this is kind of a visual illustration of the dynamics that we see across cultures. And this is just one kind of illustration. There are different views and kind of different theories, but this is kind of one of the more famous ones. An empirical study found evidence for differences among individuals with different views of self. And this is found in imaging studies, in particular fMRI studies. In this study, Westerners showed different regions of brain activation when asked to list traits about themselves and mothers. Chinese showed activation patterns in the same regions for the two tasks. Representatives for themselves and their mothers are not that distinct, both reflect self-concept. Okay, so kind of the idea here is I show a picture, or I ask, I should say, to list traits about yourself and your mother to two groups, a group of, we'll just say Westerners and a group of Chinese college students. And what research has found that when individuals are asked to rate traits or to describe traits about themselves in mothers, Westerners show different areas of brain activation, while Chinese individuals show similar patterns of brain activation. So this is kind of neurological evidence that when describing somebody in your in-group among Chinese individuals, they have similar brain activation, because this kind of theorized interdependent view of self, this wherein in kind of this collectivist culture more generally, wherein these social relationships, and specifically these in-group social relationships, define who you are and are so related to you. So you would expect to see that at a neurological level, and you do, with similar levels or similar patterns of brain activation when describing the traits of yourself and your mother in Chinese samples versus different patterns of neural activation in American samples or Western samples more broadly when asked to list traits about themselves in mothers. So skipping slightly ahead, what makes a person remain stable over the years? Genetic makeup contributes to continuity, it's argued, lasting effects of childhood experiences, environments remain stable, and gene-environment correlations can promote continuity. An extrovert's early sociability will elicit friendly responses from others, cause her to seek out social activities, and in the process strengthen her initial tendency to be extroverted. So kind of just a few points here. We have kind of this this genetic makeup that is thought to be continuous throughout the life. We also have lasting effects of childhood experiences. So you can think of particular important moments of development. You can think of maybe adverse childhood events where the culmination of all those adversity contributing to particular developmental outcomes, which have lifelong developmental outcomes. Environments remaining stable. So, typically people don't leave the country. Many people don't even leave their state where they grow up. So this environment remaining stable, thus really their personality kind of being a good fit or a good enough fit within their environment, thus making their personality remain stable over time. And gene-environment correlations. So an extrovert who's kind of typical extroverted behavior as a child, eliciting friendly responses, which that child likes, and then as the child grows older, that adolescence will then kind of repeat that behavior with friends, and theoretically receive more positive responses, and which kind of in totality will reinforce and strengthen that initial extroversion, like predisposition or that extroversion tendency early on in life. So skipping ahead again, talking about the midlife crisis, Levinson believed that there is a transition period from age 40 to 45. This is described as a midlife crisis, where a person questions his life structure and raises unsettled issues. There's not much support for Levinson's claim that adults universally experience a psychic crisis. Most researchers agree that there is a midlife questioning period in response to life events at a variety of ages, maybe less common in other countries where youth isn't as emphasized. So kind of this old understanding that once you hit a certain age, you kind of have a meltdown, and that you're just questioning everything about your life. And research really doesn't support the universality of this experience. And researchers tend to describe the moments of questioning as a kind of a midlife questioning period, and rather than it being this universal experience, it's really in response to particular life events that occur at a variety of ages. And there may be cultural effects on the degree and the frequency of midlife questioning. So, for example, maybe less common in other countries where youth isn't as emphasized. So you can imagine a culture that really values wisdom as an individual, or places older adults in like a place of social prestige within a culture. Individuals within that culture, who are approaching that age where you're described as elderly, wise, and belonging to us that or belonging at that age where you receive that increased level of social prestige, you can imagine that at levels of questioning of like, what are you doing with your life? I've wasted my life. I'm about to die. Those kind of midlife crisis typical kind of questions would expect to be less frequent or less severe in cultures that place less emphasis on youth and also place greater emphasis on the wisdom of older adults, for example. Vocational development and adjustment. Because work is such a central part of adulthood, job loss and unemployment can threaten adults' identities, disrupt their goals, and lower self-esteem. Job loss likely to be accompanied by a cascade of other stressors, such as marriage issues, moving, social isolation, and the average man and woman held 7 full-time jobs or training positions between the ages of 18 and 36. So kind of the idea here is, and we're going to get to this a little more with retirement in a couple of slides, but the extent to which you have kind of autonomy in your decision, rather to retire or if you're unemployed, impacts the negative effects associated with losing a job or an unemployment, for example. And kind of go back to a constant theme of this chapter and throughout the class is that these larger macro structures matter. So if you become unemployed in a country that does not provide unemployment, or maybe kind of looks down upon the unemployed, blames the unemployed, individuals will have higher likelihood of experiencing negative developmental outcomes as a result. So maybe more depression, or in cultures where it matters, lower self-esteem, threatening their goals more generally, having physical health problems. And that can be not just because of losing a job, but literally losing your income and then becoming homeless, for example. And that kind of bleeds into the other point where jobs loss is likely to be accompanied by a cascade of other stressors. So you lose a job, now say you're barely scraping by, or you have enough, but you're not like wealthy. That can contribute to troubles in the home among parent-child relationships or spousal relationships, which can lead to marriage issues, moving, and social isolation. And again, kind of this idea again that these larger structures can contribute to that. And the people who are most at risk, you can imagine, kind of going back to that scenario where you're barely making it by, are individuals who've already had to experience a lot of other stressors. So that accumulation of stressors, once you have a kind of large stressor at the end of life, aka losing a job, they are more vulnerable. Individuals with higher ACEs, for example, are more vulnerable to a cascading of other stressors, which contribute to various negative developmental outcomes. So this gets back to what environment you're living in this case, a pandemic, and what are the stressors, I should say, that are present within your environment, and what are the buffers that exist within your environment, and those macro buffers can impact lower levels and kind of trickle down effects on spousal relationships, for example, divorce, moving, social isolation, etc. And finally, retirement age. Just after retirement, often experience a honeymoon phase. As novelty wears off, disenchantment phase, aimless, sometimes unhappy, and finally a realistic and satisfying lifestyle, which is known as the reorientation phase. Put together a realistic and satisfying lifestyle. So you kind of have this honeymoon phase, and then you go through a period of, whoa, what am I doing with my life? And then finally adapting to retirement by putting together a realistic and satisfying life is kind of the idea behind these different retirement age statuses. What makes for favorable adjustment? Retire voluntarily rather than involuntarily, and feel in control of their retirement decision. Enjoy good physical and mental health. Have positive personality traits such as agreeableness and emotional stability. Have the financial resources to live comfortably. Are married or otherwise have strong social support. So kind of going back to what I stated before, so kind of the idea is that if you retire voluntarily versus being injured on a job and you then not receiving workman's compensation, or just workman compensation that doesn't make up for the lost income, thus losing control, and thus having a higher likelihood of a non-favorable adjustment. Other things as noted, having the financial resources to live comfortably. Are you only relying on Social Security in an American setting, which isn't really that much money, or do you have other financial resources? And again, this would be different in different countries that have different kind of retirement programs. And are you married or otherwise have strong social support? So are you isolated? So are you retired and then maybe even if you did so voluntarily, but now you're all alone. And that can mean, you're single, but maybe not necessarily just single being an issue, but just do you have a stronger support network at all? Do you belong to local community groups? Do you have friends, family, etc. at all? Creating, which contributes to differences and degree to which you have a favorable adjustment. So these larger macro systems contributing to these family systems, and all of them interacting dynamically to contribute to the likelihood of favorable adjustment during retirement. All right, that's all for this week. Thanks for everyone for watching. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next week. Bye.